Let's talk about transformations for a moment. There are reflections, rotations, and glides. Looking at a reflection, I'm going to take triangle ABC and I'm going to reflect it over line AC. When I do that, this B point maps to this other point out here, which the computer automatically labels as B prime. That's B apostrophe, means one transformation. We can rename that point, point D. Then we can see that the distance, or segment AB, is congruent to segment AD. Segment BC is congruent to segment DC. Now, if you notice, the computer has it here marked C prime, because when I reflected it, the point C became C prime as well. Just like A also is A prime. So A corresponds to A, C corresponds or maps to C, B maps to or corresponds to point D. And then AC is congruent to itself. So here, these two triangles are congruent by side, 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 but it is important to note that if I were to mention that congruence, however I order the first triangle, if I say ABC, the order of the second triangle matters. So when I look at these 2 points, AB, which segment is congruent to AB? That's AD. So I have to start out AD. And then BC is congruent to DC. So then I have to, after D, put the C. The order absolutely matters, because from this order alone, without the diagram, I know which angles are congruent and which sides are congruent. Let's look at the same triangle again, but this time I'm just going to run a point through, or a segment I should say, through point A. Then I'm going to reflect triangle ABC. Once I mark this a mirror, I'm going to reflect this triangle over that segment. And you can see that even if it isn't a shared point, the correspondence remains. The computer will mark this A prime, B prime, and C prime. We can rename these as your book will. Points are named with capital letters. So here we can see the correspondence remains true, that AB is congruent to DE. It's using the single script notation. BC is congruent to EF. And the apostrophe just means that the line has moved, the segment has moved. In these two sides, segment AC and segment DF, or line L and L prime are also congruent. Remember that lines, if they're not used with, or segments, if they're not noted with two endpoints, then they use a script letter. For the sake of proofwriting, you are going to want to use the two endpoints. It will make more sense later on. Let's take a look at some rotations. I can mark that as a center and then rotate it. So now, which points correspond? Was this point B or point C? So if it rotated, it just turned. The point of rotation does not need to be one of the points of the figure. And if I rotated this an arbitrary 120 degrees, this would have been correspond to point A. This point would correspond to point B, and this point would correspond to point C. A glide is simply a slide rotation. So A corresponds to E, B corresponds to F, C corresponds to G. And they don't need to overlap. They could, but they don't have to. And it could be in any direction, up, down, left, right,